Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. What's shaking out there? 2023 has arrived. My first visit to Coast World in the new year, and our team here is pumped to be back and to be with you on a dark and stormy night. You know, as many of you have been hearing across the country, and many of you living through it, California and much of the West Coast have been pummeled by rain, snow, sleet, cold, wind, flooding, mudslides. I was in L.A. for a couple of days this past week. Didn't see animals lining up 2 by 2 and traveling in pairs toward a large wooden boat, but wouldn't have been surprised if it had happened. I love rain. I mean, I just love it. And maybe it's the negative ions, whatever the explanation. Always feel good on rainy days ever since childhood. And, of course, I moved to the driest state in the whole nation. Doesn't really make sense. It always feels like a holiday when it rains here. I make a point to get out and walk around in it. I know that probably sounds ridiculous to some of you who've been pummeled by rain. The weather's been brutal, deadly even, and some of you who've been pounded for weeks on end have probably found it harrowing, maybe feeling a little bit melancholy as a result. Well, we're here for you. It is cloudy and cold here in the desert with more rain on the way, and I say great, perfect. We're all inside, warm and toasty, snug as bugs in our homes, and some of us driving and slicing through the gloom with the heater on and the radio blasting. Excellent. So kick back, put it on cruise control for the next 4 hours. We've got your back. You probably saw the news about the great UFO report of 2022, the one that was due to be delivered by the Director of National Intelligence to Congress back around Halloween. And UFO world has been chafing and pacing and griping and wondering, where is it? Where the heck is it? You know, that deadline came and went, no report. November passes, no report. December, no report. New Year's starts, no report. Turns out the great UFO report of 2022 morphed into the not-so-great UAP report of 2023. It was finally released a few days ago. Many of you have probably read about it or read it. And I'd say in the view of most loyal residents of UFO world, it was a tad underwhelming. I mean, 10 pages maybe, including a title page, an index page, 3 pages of appendices. I think anyone paying attention to the events of the past year or two probably should have expected something along these lines. Expectations needed to be tempered a bit. You know, no one should have expected bombs to drop or any proclamations about alien bodies or crash saucers. What we got was what was hinted at months ago in that pre-bunking story in the New York Times, the one that with the slanted angle about how the Pentagon has found lots of drones and lots of balloons and aerial trash as being responsible for UFO reports that are pouring in. And that's true. Yes, drones exist. Balloons exist. Shocker. The operating assumption among ufologists, you know, the starting point for decades, not controversial at all, is that 90 to 95% of all UFO reports are likely explainable, prosaic. Misidentifications of explainable objects or phenomena, clouds, planets, rockets, drones, balloons. It's the way ufologists have always viewed this subject. And what's interesting has always been that remaining 5% or so, the cases that can't be so easily explained. The bottom line for me in this new report, skimpy though it may have been, is that reporting about UFO cases within the military is getting better. The number of cases is going up as the stigma for pilots and other service members becomes less onerous. That's a good thing. The fact that the cases are going up, that's good. The fact that they can now differentiate better between what is identifiable, what is not identifiable, that's a good thing too. It's progress. It's good the report was required by Congress at all, and that the Pentagon, the ODNI rather, has finally cranked it out. So the report may have fallen short of public expectations, but I'd say those expectations were probably unrealistic to begin with. This is the real world, and I'd say this is genuine progress. There's so much going on behind the scenes in that UFO subject right now. scientists and engineers are getting interested, and that is overwhelmingly positive. I think that's a genie that can't be stuffed back into the bottle. Tonight, we're going to learn about a group of scientists, philosophers, academics who've been inspired to go ahead and jump into the subject in all its incarnations in a big way. It's a new organization. We're going to be joined by its founder, Dr. Mike Cifone. He and his colleagues launched something called Limina, the Journal of UAP Studies, which encourages academic folks, scientists, and others to freely discuss and ponder a broad range of topics related to possible non-human intelligence, the great unknown, other realities. He will join us a couple of minutes to tell us what his organization's all about and where it might be heading. Then in the second half tonight, we're going to look back through the mists of time to the very beginning of these mysteries that we gnaw on all the time around here. Who was the first contactee? When did humans start theorizing that our planet might be visited by residents of other worlds, other planets? The answer, it goes way, way back and in many different forms. A scholar, Chris Aubeck, who has worked extensively with Dr. Jacques Vallée, has a new project that he's just unleashed. It's a focus on alien artifacts, legends, lore, cases, myths, good stuff. You're going to enjoy the heck out of this starting 2 hours from now. Webmaster Lex Lonehood and I have pulled together our usual assortment of items and oddities culled from news media around the world. We call it Knapp's News. You can find it on the Coast to Coast AM website. Among the stories there tonight, a sort of a sarcastic response to media characterizations of the ODNI report about UAP, UFOs. There have been several headlines that declared balloons, drones, but no aliens. Today, the former director of national intelligence went on Fox News and sort of rained on that parade by announcing that there are genuine unknowns among the cases being investigated, that they're not all drones and balloons, that this really is a matter of national security and global significance. It's a good piece. Check it out. We have a few titillating science stories as well, one about NASA's plans to build another mega telescope specifically to look for alien civilizations out there somewhere. Got a think piece about the effects, the potential effects of traveling at the speed of light, what it would be like. And a really fascinating profile of a wolf man, not a werewolf man, but a wolf man. This is the story of the lead naturalist who oversaw the return of wolves to Yellowstone, which, if you've read about it, it transformed the entire environment there, had positive effects way beyond what anyone foresaw. The guy's retiring, so the story is a look back at his amazing career, his amazing work. It's a cool piece. Those stories and a lot more in Knapp's News. And while you're on the website, check out how to become a Coast Insider. The cost is about 15 cents a day if you subscribe for a year. Gives you access to a huge archive of programs and interviews, including the Art Bell Vault, classics, all of them. You can listen as often as you want, anytime you want. It's a great deal. So, too, is a subscription to Beyond Belief. That's George Norrie's television program, where George interviews fascinating guests about cutting-edge topics, similar to what he does so well here on the radio. With that, let's assume the position. Bring in the dog and the cat and that family of mallards living out there in the rain. Put on a pot of joe, slide your bod into those warm flannel jammies and your toes into your plush bunny slippers. Plop yourself down in a comfy spot, turn down the lights, and turn up the radio, because we're about ready to rumble. In a moment, Dr. Mike Cifone, the Society for UAP Studies. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Mike Cifone received a Ph.D. from the University of Maryland in the philosophy of science. His research focused on the conceptual foundations of theoretical physics and the metaphysical implications of relativity and quantum theories. Let's try saying that real fast a couple of times. He taught widely in philosophy, the philosophy of science, ethics, and logic at various universities and colleges across the country. Since 2016, he's been a lecturer in philosophy for the City University of New York's Bronx campus. Early last year, he founded Limina, the Journal of UAP Studies, and the Society for UAP Studies, in an effort to provide the UAP community with serious academic infrastructure for peer-reviewed scholarly publication, academic meetings, debate, dialogue, sustained cooperation, and exchange, kind of creating a safe zone for discussion of this among professionals. Mike, welcome to Coast.
Thank you, George. Good to be here with you.
Let's start this way. Is there an event, a news story, or a case, or a development that led you to think about creating the society and the journal?
Well, yeah, I guess it goes back to when I was recovering from COVID a while back. It'll be almost 2 years, and it'll be 2 years in June. Actually, I'm just laid up in bed and recovering, and I had a really awful kind of side effect or whatever, a secondary problem from the COVID. It was like a heart issue, and I was recovering, and I read this paper by Kevin Knuth and Robert Powell and Peter Reale of SCU. I don't know if you've ever come across this paper. It was published it's the Estimating Flight Characteristics paper, 2019, and I had heard about obviously everybody, unless you're living on Antarctica, maybe, everybody knows about UFOs. So I've been curious about it. There's been a couple of stories in my own family, relatives seeing, incredible things, on the way down to Atlantic City in the 1970s. There's one story. So we've had our own stories in our family about unidentified aerial phenomena, as they're now called. So I've been kind of curious about it, but I never really paid it much attention. I focused on mainstream physics, theoretical physics, relativity and quantum theory. But as a philosopher, I'm open. But a couple of years ago, I'm for whatever reason, I think I might have saw Kurt Mungle, Theory of Everything or something with. I think it was, and something struck me about his honesty and sincerity about this phenomenon, which I hadn't really delved into much, and I just kind of thought it was curious. And I like many people, chock full of life, right?
Right. We're losing you. Your phone is breaking up, so maybe hold it kind of steady next to your mouth there. Maybe once we go to a break, we might have to change something. But okay. Please continue. So, so there are. Go ahead.
Yes, I was reading that paper, and something struck me about it, and it was just the simple sort of calculations based on the radar, data that was obtained in a certain. A couple of key cases, like the Japan Airlines 1628 case back in '86, and then, of course, the Nimitz case. And then reading that paper and just looking at the calculations of the velocity and accelerations, I was just like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. This is coming off of the radar data, right? With multiple eyewitnesses, right, corroborating it. So these are radar visual cases, right? So I just, it just struck me like there's really something to this phenomenon. And then when I read into the literature, I just kind of realized how fraught and how scattered what they call ufology is. And I just really saw a need for academic infrastructure, disciplinary structure that we have, in the Academy for Physics, logic, philosophy, all of the disciplines, right? And that's, it kind of just inspired me. And I've been, digging into it and trying to build this infrastructure ever since.
You, as a guy who studies, writes about, teaches philosophy of science and philosophy of related to physics, do you have more flexibility than some of your colleagues, the more hard science guys? I mean, even today, there are physicists who are pretty reluctant to jump into this.
Yeah, I mean, as having been in philosophy, right? I think I have a little bit more luxury to explore topics which are considered fringy, and a little bit off of the beaten track, right? So, there's a tradition in philosophy of just sort of radical thought, So we feel unafraid, I think, to tackle these subjects and speak about them. There's a great paper published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1950 around. All right, just when the whole saucer craze was breaking out in the United States. And a philosopher who used to live not too far from me in the Hollywood Hills, right here. I'm in Los Angeles in Hollywood. He's writing in 1950. Maybe this was a thing you could only say in the 1950s before the cultural consciousness got really locked down on the side of being against this as being a real phenomenon. But in that paper, it's amazing. In a mainstream major philosophy journal, Journal of Philosophy, this guy's writing about the phenomena, possibility of there being life in the universe, and what this phenomenon could possibly be, and obviously being open to it, really representing, contact possibly, with a non-human intelligence of some kind. Just exploring that question and that possibility openly. Right, and that's mainstream Journal of Philosophy. It's amazing how things have changed.
Well, it is, and it's 5 or 6 years now, but which is not weeks, but it is amazing the transformation that's happened in those 5 or 6 years. You have Avi Loeb, who's formed an organization based at Harvard that suddenly acceptable for people at that level to go ahead and discuss this and plan out research projects. SCU that you mentioned, there has been an organization called SSE, the Society for Scientific Exploration, that's had a journal for a long time. But even though their members are really credible, great credentials, they still were viewed as sort of fringe. You couldn't get a UFO UAP paper published in one of the main science journals. I don't know if you could even now, but wow, what a transformation in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and I should mention that I'm also part of SCU. That's where I started. And I don't know what it was, George. I mean, I just became so passionate about the topic because the potential significance for humanity is profound. I mean, as we all know, right? So it's just one of these things where it just captures you, and I've just kind of maintained this high level of engagement with this question. And, I am still reading, but I'm reading everything I possibly can about the topic. But like I said, it's a sort of and I think we talked about this when we were first talking last week. Ufology, the study of the phenomenon, is so fraught, not only because it's taboo and fringe, but because of that fact of it being fringe, it's not allowed to exist within the standard framework of scientific investigation, analysis, and hypothesis testing, right? It exists in the outside. So you have a lot of amateur, researchers and investigators who are doing the sort of legwork, trying to record the phenomenon, right? But they're not scientists. They are citizen scientists. They're amateurs, almost like amateur astronomers. But so that therefore, right, the research being done, the investigations and so on are sort of touch and go. They're sort of very scattered and of highly variable quality, right, throughout the history of at least the modern fascination with this phenomenon. So what I see is a real big gap. A lack in disciplinary structures that we have within the academy for reining in the speculation surrounding the empirical data that we can obtain about this phenomenon. And there is empirical data, right?
Oh, yeah.
That we have, but that's also the problem, is that we haven't yet convinced the mainstream community that there is a solid core of empirical data, what I like to call the recalcitrant residuum. You mentioned in the beginning of your program, 90 to 95%, we know we can eliminate with the standard, array of conventional explanations. natural phenomena, misidentification, et cetera. But there is this core. Nobody seems to want to accept that, at least in the mainstream media and mainstream science yet.
Yeah, I'll just add this, is that 90%, 9 out of 10 cases are explainable, but it's also true that 9 out of 10 are never reported at all because of the stigma attached. Talking with Mike Cifone about his new UFO UAP organization. I don't know if you saw the mention in the news this week about John Fogerty regaining a controlling interest in his own songs. These are classic songs that he wrote and recorded 50 years ago, huge hits, songs that we all know and love. We play them a lot here on Coast, but they were wrangled away from him through means that don't sound all that honorable. And after half a century, this week, Fogerty and his wife Julie, his secret weapon, worked out a deal to get them back under his control. What a struggle it's been. And man, I don't know if you've seen his social media, but he's beaming like when his kids were born. I mean, he's been a guest on this program in the past with George Norrie. I was thrilled to get to meet him a couple of years ago, interviewed him for television. Since then, he kind of stays in touch now and then. So I've been sharing emails with him about this news. And wow, he is so happy, and we're happy for him. Those songs are his creations. They're his offspring. So maybe we can get him back here sometime soon to talk about that development, how he pulled it off, and more about music. We'll wait and see. But John Fogerty, congratulations. We return with Dr. Mike Cifone talking about UAP studies right after this. Dr. Mike Cifone, I can recall back when I first started jumping into this stuff, I figured I wanted to go out and find what mainstream scientists, astronomers, physicists, what they think about the topic. Have they done any research? Did they read something and then decide, oh, this is not for me, there's nothing to it, it's all bunk? And what I found was they would say, the ones I interviewed would say, well, I've read pretty much everything there is in the journals, but there really isn't much evidence. And it was just, I had to laugh because there is nothing in the journals. There were no UFO articles in science journals back then. None. You couldn't get them published. They'd laugh you out. You might be able to get a debunking article published, but not something pro-UFO. Hey, let's look at the evidence. And that is changing now. I wonder if you detect any kind of stigma still attached in academic circles. Do you have to tread lightly here? Do you have to worry about your own tenure or what your university thinks about it?
Not really. I mean, I feel pretty much insulated from all of that. And a lot of professors who when they get tenure, they're fine, and they can dabble in it or even be open about it, right? Because you really can't be touched much. But I mean, personally, I don't feel that. Especially in the City University of New York and Bronx, I don't really feel that worry personally. But a lot of people do. So I'm not, I'm perhaps the exception there.
I would think that Avi Loeb at Harvard, considering his credentials, his stature, that his decision to go ahead and take a look at this spreads pretty far in academic circles, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but honestly, I haven't really. I mean, I'm not necessarily the best person to talk to about this. Maybe if you talk to me in a few months, because I'm going to be doing a lot of traveling for the organization. I'm meeting researchers, academics, and academics all over the world. Basically, I'm really trying to develop our network far and wide. So maybe I will get a sense of how much reach Avi's his initiatives have within the community, within the academic mainstream community broadly.
The thing is, there is meat on the bone to study. You mentioned Dr. Knuth, and SCU had written a really great paper on the Tic Tac incident. They did an analysis of another case, a transmedium case in Puerto Rico that was really, you could do good work here. There is stuff to study and to analyze.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm just not sure how much traction that kind of stuff has, right? I mean, SCU is more or less unknown in mainstream academia. And I don't, Avi Loeb, of course, he's made impact given that he's published this book on the Oumuamua, sort of case which he argues is possibly right an interstellar vehicle of some kind because of its acceleration profile. But yeah, I don't think that really doesn't have much. My sense is it doesn't really have much traction. All that doesn't have much traction.
And that's
what I'm trying to change.
Right.
Right.
Is that so? That's the impetus.
I'm trying to bring into the fold people who are, really gifted, talented, smart, capable of handling the questions of the empirical data, the analysis of it, and the interpretation of that, trying to offer an explanation for that data. So I'm trying to interest, people who are really, really able to do this, but who are not necessarily known or who don't have a vested interest in the UFO issue at all, who are just interested scientists. Like, we got to the conference. Through Kevin Knuth, I was able to be put in contact with Daniel Kuhn, who is, a very accomplished theoretical particle physicist at the Niels Bohr Institute. I mean, you can't get any more mainstream and prestigious than Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, right?
Right.
And Daniel, he just published a really important. It's not universally a great text, but it's a super important work in the exposition of the problem of studying UAP, right? I mean, it's a great illustrative text that explains sort of or shows you, like, here's how you should describe the problem. Here's how you should analyze the different cases, and here's sort of a balanced kind of approach to that analysis. And it's problematic because Daniel Kuhn is not a seasoned ufologist who's been doing this for 20 or 30 or 40 years, like some people have been doing. But still, it's a very significant. The phenomenon from a sort of a scientific analytic perspective. So we invited him to be at the conference in February, and he gladly accepted. So this is the kind of person, right, that we want to attract into the organization, right? These people who are very accomplished, gifted, capable, either physicists or in general, academics, whatever field they're in, who are interested in looking at the data that we have, the actual data, right? So this sort of gives me hope that there are lots of other people like Daniel Kuhn and other people like Anna Maria Barea, who's on the NASA panel, who I correspond with occasionally. These are interested people, right? They want to learn what we know, in terms of the historical archival, reporting that's been done for many, many decades on the phenomenon, and research that's being conducted by our civilian organizations. Because, as we said, there really is something here in those 3 to 5% of unexplained cases. The 171, for example, that the ODNI report indicates remain unexplained. The question, of course, is it recalcitrant? Are these cases resisting attempts to explain them? And that's the crucial issue, right? When you look at these hard-to-explain cases, what do you do with them? And
right.
That's what I want these scholars to look at, right, is that core, that recalcitrant residual set of cases. What do you say, right, about the Nimitz? What do you say about Japan Airlines 1628? What do you say about, the Levelland, Texas, the Coyne, helicopter case? What do you say about these really hard-to-explain cases, right? That's the question.
Well, if you're a debunker, you pull something out of your hat, I'll say, and you throw it against the wall. And if that doesn't work, you throw something else against the wall and see if anything sort of sticks. It doesn't have to explain it. It just has to explain it away.
Yeah, well, it has to. What would be the right way of describing that? It sort of plausible deniability, kind of the equivalent of that, right?
Just muddy the waters, just create confusion and give a an excuse for people to move on to something else.
Just enough doubt, I guess, to make it seem like we can ignore it, I guess.
I know that even from Blue Book, Project Blue Book, where the Air Force was really doing its best to explain things away. A lot of people look at that body of work and say, well, the problem is, and I think they're implying it with the U.S. ODNI report too, the problem is we just don't have enough information to explain these things away. If we had a little bit more info, more sensor data, we could explain them just fine. But I think what you found with Project Blue Book is, despite their great attempts to explain things away, the truly inexplicable cases, the more information you had, the more inexplicable they became, not the other way around.
About this recalcitrant residuum, this set of cases that are really hard to crack, right? The more you learn about it, the more puzzling, the more vexatious they become to you, right? Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. But my question always is, there are two sets of cases, right? There's the historical cases that we look at that are pretty much set. We have just reports, right? And we can't really, after 20 years, we can't really go back and ask people questions and look at it again, right? It's pretty much just that whatever we've got, right? It's static.
Right.
That's the historical archival all these, civilian organizations, and, NASA's trying to jump into the fold, and the U.S. is trying to accumulate data. That's the dynamic present-day data-gathering operation stuff. UAPX is gathering stuff. Kevin Knuth and Matt Shadagas's group. The SCU is engaged in some on-the-ground, research. And that's been done. For decades, there have been certain groups that try to collect real-time data on this stuff. But my question is, what more exactly do we need here? I want to know, in the Kirkpatrick presentation that that was released out on the internet, I want to know what they call what's the whole point of the study? Is RO wants to resolve these cases. Well, what does resolution look like? Right. I want to know what resolution looks like in a case which is, like the Nimitz case, where you've got multiple eyewitnesses up close, multiple radar systems involved, looking at stuff coming in out of low Earth orbit, weather radar, onboard, pilot radar, visual confirmation, people seeing it in the big eyes on the ship, sonar data. What more do you need, right? What else do you need to
we know that there is... We know, for example, there is a great deal of additional information that has not been made public and probably won't be because it's sensitive sensor data. The means of acquisition of the information is not going to be made public because of national security concerns. I suspect you mentioned about NASA. They got a team together. They want to dive into this. I will bet you right now that they are asking for and being rebuffed in their requests for information from the Department of Defense or the ODNI, Arrow. Hey, can you share some of that sensor data with us to let us see why it makes these cases unexplainable? They're being told no. I'll bet you.
Right. The answer is going to be no. But you see the point I'm making. What? This is what I kind of want to get our scholars to think about right during the conference. What is the threshold of establishing an actual anomaly for which current understanding of physics and technology is incapable of explaining? What's the actual threshold? We haven't had that discussion, honestly. Nobody talks about that. All they talk about is we need more data. But that's not the right question. The question is, what are the epistemological criteria? What are the methodological criteria that such that if we satisfy it and can declare we have an anomaly, right? Like
Right.
you do in particle physics, and in the social sciences and other sciences. You've got certain, statistical thresholds, 2 sigma or 5 or, whatever it is, standard deviations, right? You have certain, generally accepted criteria of the declaration of an anomaly and a discovery. I want to have that discussion. What does that actually look like right here? Nobody's talking. It doesn't seem to me that everybody's talking about more data, but we're not talking about the foundations of our interpretation of the data. That's what I'm trying to get scholars to think about.
Well, you've studied science, the philosophy of science. You know the importance of anomalies, right? That is where the science makes its big leaps. It's not when they find more information to prove what they've already accepted. It's when an anomaly jumps out. That's when you make real progress.
Yeah, but that's the problem, George, right? Because as the dirty little secret, right, if you study the history of science, the dirty little secret is there's always going to be a significant fraction. In fact, most scientists are going to be conventional thinkers who are going to try to conventional line of thinking till their dying breath, right? So you look at the debate around Einstein's theory early on when he published his paper in 1905 for relativity. Nobody really could accept his premises in that paper. Well, most people couldn't because it made no damn sense, right? He wanted to assume that the speed of light was constant for all observers. That doesn't make any sense. If you hold a flashlight and I walk towards a wall at 5 miles an hour, you would think that the velocity, that I'm walking with towards the wall would add itself to the light. It would be the speed of the light plus 5 miles an hour because you carrying the flashlight walking towards the wall would be adding that velocity to it. That's called the addition of velocities. That's a standard principle in Newtonian thought. Einstein said in the case of electromagnetic radiation, namely light, that is false. People were like, how could that be false? That's ridiculous. Centuries of science has told us that the addition of velocities apply to absolutely every velocity. Doesn't matter whether it's light or not. But Einstein flew in the face of that conventional thinking. And people to their dying day, the great Heinrich Lorentz, tried to construct a view of the world in which that addition of velocities was maintained. That Newtonian perspective was maintained. So it takes a while,
right,
for the unconventional to be accepted, right?
Mike, we're going to have to take a break here. We're talking with Dr. Mike Cifone about this new organization and a journal that he has founded. We'll get into that in a moment. Check out how the international scientific community might be reacting to the changes underway. He mentioned about the slow pace of how science will accept different ideas. It's blunt but true, but science and knowledge advance one funeral at a time. That's one famous quote that maybe we can discuss on the other side. We're talking with Dr. Mike Cifone, philosopher of science, academic guy who's put together a new UAP-related organization. They're not just studying flying saucers, lights in the skies, things of that sort. It's a much broader spectrum. I'm going to hear what they're going to be looking at, how broad that spectrum might be, what the international scenario is for academics in other countries, and then we'll open up the phone and see what's in your mind here on Coast to Coast AM. Mike, let's talk about your organization. When we discussed, had a conversation on the phone a couple of days ago, you told me that what you really want to do is create a safe space. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I want to create a space where academics who are curious or who are interested in discussing the topic can feel sort of feel free to come forward in a space where we don't take any particular thesis, about explaining UAP, but that we're just simply open to examining the data from from as objective a standpoint as we possibly can on the one hand, and on the other hand, being interested in discussing the sort of foundational questions about if they're aspects to this phenomenon, namely involving the participant within the encounter itself, what all is involved, in that kind of scenario, almost like an anthropologist, right? When you study another culture, you're studying something, right? Your object of study as an anthropologist is going to react to you studying the phenomenon. So we have to be aware of the whole range of issues, whether we're dealing with a force of nature, whether we're dealing with an intelligence, whatever it happens to be, we have to kind of discuss in general the criteria, the methodological criteria of analyzing these different possibilities. So I want to create like that neutral space, where we can just, without taking a position, we can discuss what we would need to do, methodologically speaking, to study a phenomenon like that, right? So I want to provide just enough distance between taking a position in the phenomenon and studying it for academics to come out of the, the woodwork, come out of the shadows, and talk meaningfully, significantly, and openly about how we ought to study it if we were to attack this question seriously.
So it's, UAP is at the heart of it. That doesn't just mean flying saucers, though. How broad do you imagine you're going to go?
Well, right, exactly. I don't, we don't, in many cases, there seems to be a structured object. You might call it a vehicle or a craft of some kind, right? Like the Nimitz case, the Tic Tac, right? That presents to our human senses as a moving vehicle, what we would describe as a vehicle. But I'm enough of a Star Trek nerd, right, to know that distinction between manufactured craft and sort of natural, maybe organism or phenomenon of nature, maybe that's a little blurry. Like in a recent movie, which I consider a really brilliant, fantastic movie, Nope. Maybe that distinction is a little bit blurry, but we have to be educated and sensitive enough and understand, and especially in the history of philosophical thought, which tries to nuance that distinction between manufactured and and natural. We have to be sophisticated enough to be able to handle cases which are really going to be blurry. So I want to open up the whole range of possibilities. I mean, maybe we're dealing, in some cases, maybe not the Nimitz case is a good example. Maybe something like Hessdalen in Norway, and during our conference, there's going to be representatives of the Hessdalen project at our conference. Maybe, with those kinds of phenomena, where, you're looking at sort of luminous objects that present more like plasmas or something like that, maybe you're dealing with a kind of, some kind of strange form of intelligence, which we really don't, we have no categories for yet. So that's where philosophy comes in, to be able to consider a range of possibilities for the description of the ontology. In other words, the being, the kind of being that we are engaging. That's why philosophy is really, this is, my own tradition, is really important here, because there's centuries, of tradition of thinking about the nature of being, the nature of beings and intelligence that can kind of help us, to give us some structure for thinking about these very, vexatious, empirical, accounts that we have in the record and going forward. Because, we have to really give guidance. Philosophy also and the humanities gives guidance to the sciences. It helps sort of structure the way that we think about nature and the various phenomena of nature. It helps kind of give us, some kind of structure there. So that's why this is the whole range has to be open, right? It can't just be scientists and engineers, like the Travis Taylor types. It's got to be, a whole range of thinkers. Kevin Knuth, he's a theorist, astrophysicist, theoretical astrophysicist, theoretical physicists like Daniel Kuhn is involved in that kind of thinking, of the foundations of physics, and philosophers and anthropologists, even sociologists. The whole range. This is really an all hands on deck kind of.
I saw some of the names. Some of the names are pretty familiar here. Jeff Kripal and Alexander Wendt, and political science, and
exactly.
There are a lot of different angles to cover. Tell me this: what is the reception so far in the international community? We kind of get wrapped up in American ufology. We think it's an American issue. It's not. It's a worldwide issue, and I wonder if there's any enthusiasm among your colleagues elsewhere.
Oh my God! Yeah, I have to say, George, there is an incredible amount of enthusiasm, and they're really excited and happy to see that a U.S. originated organization is extending a welcoming hand to all organizations all around the globe. So I'm going to be meeting with people in the United Kingdom, in France, in Portugal, especially also in Germany, connections to the Middle East, which is a big, gap, I think, in our understanding of this phenomenon, how it's received within Middle Eastern and Islamic culture. Also, right, we have colleagues from Asia joining us, right? And it's interesting that Kirkpatrick, in that slide deck that you shared with me, Kirkpatrick conference in 2000, I think it was the 1990s actually, where they call for global cooperation and exchange of information. We all talk about, I've heard this talked about in the literature that I have so far read, but no one has actually built, that infrastructure, cooperative exchange. That's what the Society of UAP Studies is being developed, accomplished, is that ecosystem of sustained international and dialogue among all researchers all over the world. The ODNI report, on page 6, it talks about, a whole of government approach to resolving UAP events, and that's a quote. Well, I say, why don't we as civilian organizations mirror that whole of government approach and universalize that and extend that whole of the world approach, the whole of the UAP community approach, to coordinating our efforts in studying this phenomenon worldwide, right? So the society is hoping to be and to provide precisely that missing global infrastructure for, to sort of what I like to call an ecosystem of exchange among all researchers.
What do you make of that ODNI report that came out? The UFO world is a bit underwhelmed, but I thought there was some good stuff in it. The fact that it exists at all, that they admit the number of cases is going up, that the process is streamlined. They didn't give us much detail, but detail we did get was pretty good.
Yeah. The reports, unlike, right, if you read, like for example, I read, a pair of Wall Street Journal articles that came out January 12th and 13th. You read the factual report, by Warren Strobel, and, he emphasizes what the ODNI report does, if you read it carefully, which, some debunkers like to kind of wash over this, which is that 107 remain uncharacterized and unattributed. The interesting cases. But you read, the opinion piece, the op-ed by Holmes Jenkins in the Wall Street Journal, and he wants to dismiss it all. He says, the genie can't be put into the bottle because 170 remain unexplained. But the truth is out there. If 100% of explained events don't involve aliens, what is the assumed rate of alien involvement in the unexplained event? So it's a confused kind of, description of what they're claiming. They're claiming that there are, a subset of cases which remain, very difficult, if not, impossible to resolve. Now, of course, the question is, do we need more information? And that's the big question. I mean, if the ODNI is saying that these can't be resolved, presumably they have access to that information, which we do not, I assume.
Well, we know for sure they do. We know for sure that they do, because the chief scientist for the first UAP task force report, and a lot of those cases became part of this one, said as much. There's a lot of information that they have that they can't make public.
Right. So if ODNI in this report, right, is saying anyone remain unexplained, well, that has to mean something very significant, because they presumably have access, as you just stated, to information which we, civilians who do not have classification status are not, don't have access to. So it's their data is indicating that 171 cases so far remain unexplained. That's got to mean something really important. Now, unfortunately for us on the outside, we don't know what exactly that means, because we know the information is that we can't share. Right?
Well, we do know it's around 30%. It's more than 30% of the cases they've looked at so far. So that's a pretty good chunk.
Yeah. Now, what in that report, and I'm flipping through it, and I'm trying to get to the it's on page 5. And let me just read you a little bit part of this. It says, since its establishment in July 2020, ARO has formulated and stated and started to leverage a robust analytic process against identified UAP reporting. Once completed, ARO's final analytic findings will be available in their quarterly reports to policymakers. My question, and this is just a genuine question to you, George, do we have access to these so-called quarterly reports? What are these quarterly claim are more detailed? Do we have access to that?
We do not.
Do we know what's in those reports?
No, we do not.
Are they classified?
Well, some of it is. Enough of it what they're submitting to Congress, quite a bit of that is classified. The version that went to Congress that we don't get to see is classified. So
yeah,
I'm not holding my breath.
Reports. Yeah. Right. That's interesting to me. Quarterly reports to policymakers, So, are all of them classified or not? So I would be curious to sort of get access to those reports, because they claim, there's more, you've got sort of more characterization of exactly what's going on here. But, just a curious, that was a curious bit in the ODNI report. So.
Yeah, I share your enthusiasm on one level, the fact that the report exists, the number of incidents that are coming in are increasing, that they still have a significant percentage, more than 30% of the cases cannot be explained as drones or balloons or trash, although I'm sure that they would explain them away if they could, but they can't so far.
Presumably. Right. I mean, if we assume they're being honest to Congress, right? I mean, so,
yeah, well, that may be jumping too far, I think.
Right.
So the reaction at the international level is good. You're getting a lot of interesting responses domestically, and the conference is going to be held next year. What about the journal? Tell us about the journal.
No, the conference, just to be clear, George, the conference will be held in 3 weeks.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's in February.
Oh, that's right.
So,
you won't. That's right.
Yeah, it's February. Now, you're going to be there, so make sure you mark your calendar, February 5th for your appearance there.
I'd better write that down then, shouldn't I?
Yeah. No, it's soon. Yeah, and after, very soon after the conference, I will be going basically around the world. I'm hoping to get to the Middle East at some point, but I'll be in Europe in March and May. And I've got meetings with, many of the figures in the UAP community and the world, in that part of the world, in Europe, basically.
Well, the Middle East, as you mentioned, is kind of a gap here. We in the West, we don't get a lot of information about UFO, UAP related, and look at those. Those are pretty old civilizations that go way back, and they have what we would call myths, but certainly cases and incidents that go way back, and we don't hear much about them.
Yeah, there's a German scholar who lives in Qatar, in Doha, in the capital, or a university. What is it? The Virginia University, Commonwealth University of the Arts in Doha, and he writes extensively. His name is Jörg Dettermann. He's a German. He writes extensively about the reception of this phenomenon in culture. Your next guest is going to be Chris Auerbach, right? Aubeck?
Yeah.
And he's one of these researchers who's interested in the historical sort of aspect of unidentified aerial phenomena reporting, and Jörg Dettermann chronicles that kind of a thing specifically within the Middle Eastern culture. So he'll be at our conference. I'm hoping, to be able to connect to him very soon to learn, how this phenomenon has been received within Middle Eastern culture. Because, all of our cultures, we have theological, philosophical, and now, of course, scientific frameworks for receiving these phenomena. In other words, theology, philosophy, and science provide us with a vocabulary of describing these events and these phenomena and these encounters. So it's a very curious issue of how throughout history the various cultures have received this phenomenon, right? And that's something I'm very, very much in that, the historical the
right.
history reception of this phenomenon.
Dr. Mike Cifone is our. Yeah. I'm going to have to interrupt you. We got to go to a break. Mike Cifone is my guest. We're going to go right to the phones when we come back here on Coast to Coast AM. Coming up at the top of the hour, Chris Aubeck joins us to talk about Volume 1 of a massive project he's unleashing, Alien Artifacts from Antiquity to 1880, the forgotten story of how we came to believe in visitors from the stars. In a moment, though, for our remaining segment with my guest, Mike Cifone, we're going to go right to the phone, see what's on your mind. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. All right, Mike, let's find out what our Coast listeners have on their minds. We're going to the wild card line. Brendan in Austin, Texas. Hey, Brendan, you're on with Dr. Mike Cifone.
Thank you so much, George and Dr. Cifone. If you're a fan of George Knapp, follow his podcast at Mystery Wire. It's amazing. And I'm hoping that this journal that you're making will help change the paradigm and will bring in some self-care for the experts also. George, I hope you and all the experts out there, it's been really emotional with all the ups and downs, so I hope that you guys do some self-care and take care of yourselves so you can keep on going. My question is Carl Jung had said that the UFO topic is a reflection of our own psyche, kind of like a Rorschach test. And just to put it super simply, the military think about killing people and scientists think about science. So do you think that with this new journal, you're bringing in like a new perspective? And do you think that the secrecy and cover-up will taint the ET topic forever, or will it change as our psyche changes? Thanks, guys.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're really trying to turn the page here with the study of this phenomenon. But so to that point, yeah. But to answer your question, yeah, certainly the phenomenon, in some sense, right, is going to be like, I think you mentioned the Rorschach, test. It will be a reflection of not only of our individual psyche, but it'll be a reflection of our cultural unconscious, because we describe things in terms of technological devices, but you can only imagine in thousands of years that these categories might, ridiculous or absurd. Just like the ancients, when they described the sun or the planets, they had a certain characteristic way of describing it. The sun is often described as a stone, like a burning stone in the sky. So surely there's going to be a dimension here of description which is going to be specific to our cultural. that will be a function of our collective psyche, as it were. But there's that other aspect of the phenomenon that, the sort of real core of that phenomenon, which presents to us as a definite reality, and that sort of core is the question. I mean, how do we describe that in our in scientific terms? So, that's, for me, that's the interesting issue as far as what.
Thanks, Brendan, for that call. We're going to move on to Bill in Los Angeles. Hey, Bill, hope it's not too wet for you there and you're surviving the rain. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm with you on taking a walk in the rain. I just did it right before the show to get invigorated. And Happy New Year, by the way, George. And since you mentioned Syrian guitar solos, I feel obligated to say that I stood about 30 feet from the Michelangelo of rock guitar exactly 50 years ago at the Hollywood Palladium watching Jeff Beck with his Vanilla Fudge buddies, Tim Bogert and Carmen Appice. And I'll tell you something, he was just blowing people away. And I hope that you get a chance, because I know you like the Beatles, I hope you get a chance to listen to his version on Blow by Blow of the Beatles' She's a Woman. It's just a gorgeous, personalized jazz take on that song, and it tells you all you need to know about his guitar playing.
I'm writing it down. I'm going to check that out.
But Mike, as a former journalist and one-time philosophy major, I'm amazed at how these self-proclaimed scientists like Chef Shostak and Bob Zimmerman, who are both very intelligent guys, and I've talked to them personally, they seem to reject Sir Karl Popper's falsifiability requirement for scientific hypotheses, and they always resort to non-falsifiable claims like radar error, super drones, weather inversions, and these things that we really can't get our heads around, no matter what you say. And in fact, the data are better than what these people come up with. And I just wonder, do they realize that they're rejecting their own scientific tradition by doing that?
Well, I mean, things like those, weather phenomena, or the so-called inversion. These are things that are verifiable. So I would know what they would would mean by that. But the problem with the whole criterion of verification is that if you're already committed to a particular interpretation of the phenomenon, you can, philosophy of science, we realize you can always adjust, your interpretation to match any possible disconfirming bit of evidence. Just think about the Ptolemaic system, in astronomy. You can always add extra, circles and epicycles and so on to make the Ptolemaic, Earth-centered view of the universe plausible. No singular bit of evidence conclusively disconfirms or proves any theory. That's a principle in philosophy of science that we have understood a century and a half. And that's a very important. There's no single bit of theory or hypothesis. And that's the complication that we have to think about going forward. We have to be aware of what the history of the philosophy of science has all the nature of science theory confirmation. We have to be sensitive to these subtleties, because it's simple as one bit of data here or one observation there. Much more complicated than that. Most scientists know this, right? Hopefully they know this.
Bill, thanks for that. Go ahead. Bill, thanks for the call. A lot of them have their feet dug in. It wouldn't matter what the evidence is. They'll adjust their standards and maintain the position that it can't be, therefore it isn't. And
like as Hynek said, right, over and over again. Yeah, right, exactly.
East of the Rockies, Keith in Fort Lauderdale. Good morning, Keith. You're on with Dr. Mike Cifone. Good. What's on your mind?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Cipro. Do you know Dr. Bernardo Kastrup? He's a computer engineer, and he also just picked up a Ph.D. in philosophy of mind. He made a great distinction between ontology, which is the science of being or the study of being, versus the behavior of phenomena, which is science. You know, that's stuff that's how nature behaves versus what it actually is. When you talk about the nature of something, you're talking about what, you know, the identity of what it is. These scientists don't seem to know the difference between the two. Do you know? Are you familiar with him? You should get him on your blog or whatever it is you're going to be putting together, because he's very, very well versed in making the distinction. He has these two PhDs, you know, in one is in computer science, reconfigurable into AI, and his latest PhD, I think he got it about 3 or 4 years ago, was in philosophy of mind. So this guy is, you know, has background in, you know, in engineering, physics, and also he studied everything basically that a similar path that you did, except he's coming from both ends of it. So I don't know how much you delve into that particular thing, but I think it should be a distinction made for everybody that's listening. There's a difference between science, you know, how things behave, and verifiability in that way. That's phenomenal, and what it actually is, you know, the being.
Well,
gotcha. Let's go ahead. Let's let Mike respond. Thanks.
That's interesting. I have to admit, I vaguely have heard of this guy Castro, but just the way that you've described that distinction, I would sort of take a different view. Aristotle, who really is in many ways the architect of all biology, et cetera. Aristotle actually took a much different view. Aristotle thought that the behavior of the thing did indicate its being. The behavior was the ontology for Aristotle. So I think that if we are confined to a purely observational analysis of the phenomenon, because we can't really interact with it very much. I mean, there's some electromagnetic data that we have, and hopefully some of these new civilian research organizations will provide us with a little bit more physical parameters there. But, we don't really interact with this phenomenon very consistently. We're confined to observation. And when you're confined to observation, what you see, how the phenomenon behaves is partly constitutes what the thing is, its ontology. So I would argue that in many ways there isn't a distinction, that the one leads to the other, until perhaps we can have a closer, a more fine-grained analysis of the actual phenomenon itself. In other words, if we can capture it in some way, which I think some of the ODNI that, which raises all sorts of ethical questions, right, about downing other issue.
Thank you, Keith, for that call. We lost some of your answer there, Mike, just because of a drop out of the phone. So
I'm sorry.
We're moving forward, though. Dr. Kastrup, by the way, a brilliant guy. We've had him. We've interviewed him before. He's now working with Robert Bigelow's Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies here in Las Vegas.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a really sharp guy. You should check out some of what he's written. Try to get one more call in here. Cheryl in Missouri on the wild card line. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, George Knapp. Hi, Dr. Cifone. Okay, I want to make a joke first. It's going to be a joke to lighten it up or whatever, because this is
right.
It's very cool, very cool. What would have happened if his parents named you Zach?
Yeah, I don't know.
Cifone. Okay, that was a cheesy joke. Anyway.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I know. Okay, Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, X-Files, Mulder and Scully, the truth is out there. Outer Limits, these sorts of shows are very philosophical, I think. I got minors in philosophy, and I have great respect for philosophers, especially if you're a doctor of philosophy. That's amazing. Okay. Now, this deal with like 5G, the technology and everything, Is it evolving or manipulating our brainwave patterns in any way?
Well, we're a little off the path there, Cheryl, but do you have any opinions about 5G, Mike?
I'd like to see it more consistently available on my phone. That's my first opinion.
Yeah, that makes it unanimous. Cheryl, I think we're having trouble hearing you, so I appreciate you calling, but we're going to move on. Let me ask you this, Dr. Cifone. What do you make of these stories about crash retrievals? We're hearing a lot about whistleblowers preparing to testify behind closed doors, some of whom may have already been there to testify, talking about a little more substantial or substantiation of these crash retrieval stories. What would it mean if that's confirmed, that we have material that wasn't made by us?
Oh, obviously that would be very significant if we did have, certain material that sort of, was conclusively conclusive evidence of the existence of structures of non-human origin, technological structures of non-human origin. Obviously that would be significant, but the problem is, what's the evidence for that, right?
Right.
What is it? Is it fragments? Is it entire structures that are damaged? What exactly is it that people say we possess? I want to see the evidence. Gary Nolan makes the same point, right? I want to see the evidence. And if it's going to be just things like fragments, like the Ubatuba fragments, but that's, it's hard to determine, and I'm just repeating, so sort of Gary Nolan's analysis. It's hard to determine whether or not that is extraterrestrial in origin, because what can we look at? We can only look at the atomic structure, A, and B, the isotopic ratios of the material that we find. Like, in the case of Ubatuba, we were looking at the isotopic ratios of magnesium. And we know, that the isotopes of magnesium have a particular distribution on the Earth. But that's a statistical claim, so it has to be statistical analysis. And so you're going to get a whole spread of different possibilities. Like Daniel Kuhn in his book, he covers this question for the Ubatuba samples, And as it turns out, 3 of the 4 laboratories that analyzed the Ubatuba fragments really only showed very slight, significant variations from the the isotopic ratio of magnesium found on the planet Earth. Only one from a research lab in Austin, Texas, in 2017 showed that the fragments were at 2 standard deviations from the standard distribution of magnesium. That's not very significant. For a major discovery like in particle physics, you need 5 standard deviations, right? So it's always these things are more or less generally inconclusive. So it's really hard. So the question is really, what is the character of that evidence? Is it just fragments? Is it, obviously, is it entire structures? What is it? And I want to see it. I generally don't really believe much of that until we have that evidence. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm with you on it. I've heard those stories for a long time. Haven't seen any of it, but I'm, the information that's popped up more recently comes from some pretty reliable people who've worked on the inside for a long time. So I'm kind of crossing my fingers. Dr. Mike Cifone, good luck with your event in a couple of weeks. Good luck with your journal and your society as well. The public can sign up for this event that's coming up.
Absolutely, yeah. There's you can find it on our links to the Society for UAP Studies and Limina's website. It's all there. You'll find all that information there, and we encourage everybody in the community. It's not just an academic event; it's a community-wide affair. We're trying to sort of involve the community in developing the next stage here, the next chapter, I should say, in this discourse surrounding the UAP phenomenon.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for the conversation. Wish you luck with your event coming up, and I guess I'll be talking to you soon.
Yeah, it's been an honor.
All right, Mike.
Take care.
Thanks a lot. Coming up, Chris Aubeck, Alien My next Artifact. Guest is Chris Aubeck, who's unleashed a massive project, impressive in its scope, Volume 1 of what he calls Alien Artifacts from Antiquity to 1880, the forgotten story of how we came to believe in visitors from the stars. Chris is the founder of the historical research group Magonia Exchange. It's an international archival project. He's the author of a dozen articles in English and Spanish. He contributes to radio programs in Europe, delivers talks on the subject of the evolution of UFOs as cultural history. Of note, he's the co-author of a book called Wonders in the Sky, along with Dr. Jacques Vallée, a terrific volume that we will talk about a little bit from now, and he will join us, Chris, that is, in just a moment here on Coast to Coast AM. Chris Aubeck is one of the best writers and scholars dealing with the UFO topics in the world, and we're thrilled to welcome him to the Coast to Coast program for the first time. Chris, great to have you here.
Hey, hi. Good morning from Spain.
Good morning.
To talk to you again.
It's great to have you here. And so this project, I read in the beginning how it started, I think 21 years ago. What was the impetus for it?
Well, firstly, about 22 years ago, I set up the Magonia Exchange Group, which is it's a small community of about between 100 and 200 members on the internet, which is comprised of authors, researchers, even university professors who are dedicated to looking for clues in newspaper archives and old books from the 18th, 19th century to see how far back the UFO phenomenon actually goes. So about 20 years ago, I decided to find out whether our ancestors had the same beliefs as we do today, whether they also believed that we live in a populated universe, which was full of planets, full of intelligent beings, and whether those beings were visiting us. Because what I realized was that most of the information that we know about comes from scientists who left a written record of their philosophical beliefs on the subject of a plurality of inhabited worlds. They never really speculated about whether beings from elsewhere visited us or not. But the guy in the street, normal people, farmers, shopkeepers, bartenders, they did have opinions, and curiously enough, I found that they did believe that beings from other planets were visiting us. That is to say, around the time of the American Civil War, people had very, very similar ideas about the universe and our place in it as we do today. And I decided that that's worth writing a book about. And that's what I've been doing over the last 20 years, piecing all that together.
Well, it's an amazing amount of research that went into this. There are a couple of hints that you drop in this volume 1 that you spent a heck of a lot of your youth in libraries and dusty old archives going through books. I can't imagine that there are a lot of people in the world who would spend so much time and at such a young age doing that.
Well, yeah, I've been building my own collection of UFO cuttings since I was about 15 years old, and now I'm 51. And during this time, I've amassed what I believe to be the largest collection of historical UFO reports in the world, and this has been an invaluable resource to get to the bottom of this, to find out when ufology was actually born. So through my group, Magonia Exchange, we've collected over 40,000 cuttings since we started in April 2003. And then I've also been sent other researchers entire collections of cases. And, of course, when I add this to what I've been collecting myself since I was a young man in England, it's just a huge amount of data. So over the last 10 years or so, I've withdrawn from sort of actively posting about it through my group or online, and just trying to work out exactly what happened, how it evolved. And the conclusions are really interesting because even though you can see how ufology has evolved both culturally, almost as a literary phenomenon, it doesn't negate the existence of UFOs, of course. It just means that we have to be quite careful not to reinvent the wheel, because 150 years ago, we were saying basically the same things.
You know, a lot of people, you've heard the argument over the years that a lot of what we think of as real with UFOs and aliens came from Hollywood. You know, that every time there's a new alien invasion movie comes out, that it causes spikes in UFO reports. But in fact, as you've learned and as you documented very well, this basic story has been around a really long time. How far back does it go?
Well, you can go back to, it depends on whether we're talking about a belief in extraterrestrials in general, the idea of a plurality of inhabited worlds, or the idea that maybe they are actually visiting us, or that they have that capacity. So the theory that we live in an inhabited universe started in ancient Greece. In fact, the ancient Greeks had a school called atomism, which was founded by Leucippus and Democritus in the 5th century BC. And they believed there were many solar systems like ours. And they said that most of these solar systems would contain living things like ourselves. And all of this was because they reached the conclusion that at a microscopic level, all of matter was composed of atoms, and that the same patterns would be replicated throughout the universe, which is incredible in itself, because of course they didn't have microscopes at the time. There was no way to prove it, and that of course meant that this whole school of thought didn't last very long, because they just couldn't prove any of it. But that's the conclusion they reached. Then over the next 500, 600 years, there was a certain amount of speculation about life on the moon, life on other planets. Then when you get to medieval times, when you reach the Christian period, theologians weren't happy about the idea that we were living in a highly populated universe, because they preferred to believe that God had created the Earth as a unique thing, we were totally unique in the cosmos, and so it was almost prohibited to talk about the possibility of life outside the Earth. But then in the year 1277, a bishop in Paris decided that we shouldn't be trying to put limits on God's creativity, and we shouldn't expect God to let us know if he has built other worlds and other planets. So let's accept that maybe other life exists in space. So after that meeting they had in Paris in the 13th century, theologians started talking about it again. And that was the case for several hundred years. There was lots of debate in the church at all levels about whether Jesus Christ had incarnated on multiple planets, maybe had died an infinite number of times to save mankind from some kind of primeval sin. And then around the 16th century, people started writing science fiction about this kind of topic. But then around the 17th century, 18th century, that became a lot more serious. And it seems that that was around the time that there was serious speculation about whether life could be visiting us from other planets, whether we were receiving delegations of visitors from Mars and so on. Particularly the moon at that time, of course. That was the planet of choice.
Yeah, the moon was the big one. I was amazed by how many of the biggest names in the history of science were weighed in on this. I mean, you have Aristotle early on not being a proponent of it, but Cicero and Plutarch, you say, were open to the idea of life, I think, on the moon. And there were some pretty colorful accounts of what that life might look like. That far back, what were they speculating about?
Yeah, exactly. So at that time, a lot of people used the word planet to describe the moon, and that's quite interesting because that way they could envision a moon with valleys and forests and buffalo roaming the plains and so on. I mean, there's a professor emeritus of humanities at the University of Notre Dame, Michael J. Crow, who noted that during the Enlightenment period, most intellectuals participated in the debate over extraterrestrial life, and the vast majority of them favored the idea of the plurality of worlds. So you have scientists like Galileo Galilei, who deduced that life on the moon would be very different from life on Earth, and René Descartes, who said that God could have created wonderful beings everywhere. And there were so many books published on this topic. I could say that there are probably more books about extraterrestrial life in the local bookshop in the 18th century than you'll find these days. It's an amazing time, you know.
I thought some of the most entertaining anecdotes and incidents that you dug up were of people, writers in those eras who used the idea of people on the moon or other planets in terms as literary devices and also as sarcasm.
Yeah, that's right. Because what happened was that when scientists reached the conclusion that meteorites really could come from outer space and weren't just carried by the wind from volcanoes on Earth. That was the original theory. This opened up a whole new sort of genre of speculation, science fiction, satire, and a lot more like that. People said, well, you know, if meteorites can come from other planets, if that meteorite formed part of a planet that exploded or had been on the side of a volcano that erupted and was shot off into space, maybe any temples, houses, people, cemeteries built around that volcano could also have ended up flying through the solar system and coming to Earth. So there was a period in the 19th century when they used the idea of an extraterrestrial being as a kind of offensive way to describe people who are slightly different, who maybe of a different color, of a different religion, who just dress differently, and they'd say, "Well, this guy looks like he's just come down from Jupiter. This guy looks like he's just come out of a meteorite from Mars." So it was at the beginning of the 19th century that this started to happen when people started saying, well, maybe strange people really are from other planets. And it was also a period when satirists started saying, well, the president might be from another planet because his opinions are very strange or his policies don't make any sense. And they started inventing tales about spaceships that had landed in Tenerife or anywhere. To be honest, there are lots of stories about strange spaceships from the moon, from Mars, from Venus that landed in big cities. That way, they could explain why local politicians were so strange and had such absurd ideas. So it became a very big topic, and it was something that everybody joined in. It was, practically everybody had an opinion about extraterrestrials at the time.
You know, one of the things that pops up in modern UFO books, they want to make an argument that science can often be wrong. They will point out that for a long time, even as recently as I think the 1700s, leading scientists did not believe that rocks could fall from the sky. You mentioned that they thought maybe they were spewed by volcanoes or something like that. They just couldn't believe it. And then, of course, you know, people living out in the country and in rural areas whose opinions didn't carry much weight, they keep telling them these things are real, they're coming out of the sky, and eventually science changed its mind. You make the point in this book about many times about leading scientists of their eras who have what pretty wacky theories about what was going on. People living on the sun, for example, and other things that we know now are absolutely preposterous.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, there's this theory in the 18th century that the sun could be inhabited, and the idea was even presented as evidence in a court case in 1787 involving a scientist called Dr. John Elliot, who had shot, perhaps accidentally, a young woman on the streets of London, and his defense lawyer said he was insane, and anyone who didn't think so could look at his work about life on the sun. And the fact is, this theory was not uncommon at the time, and it was proposed by notable scientists such as Sir Frederick William Herschel, the man who discovered Uranus. It's interesting because when I was 14, 15, 16 years old, I used to talk to a British author of ancient astronaut books, W. Raymond Drake, who lived in Sunderland. And he wrote many of the first books on this topic before Eric von Daniken did. And I used to call him on the phone, and we used to chat for a while. And he told me once that he believed that there was life on the sun, and that some UFOs came from the sun. This is a very, very old idea, the idea being that the center of the sun is completely cool, and what radiates all of the energy and heat is just a kind of aura that's around the sun that somehow UFOs must penetrate it if they come to Earth, but it doesn't allow us to see what's happening there. So this is a 300 or even 400-year-old idea that survived till the 20th century. In fact, if you pick up a copy of W. Raymond Drake's 1964 book, Gods and Spacemen, I think Gods or Spacemen, he has a chapter on life on the sun. Yeah, there were a lot of very interesting theories floating around at the time, and that's why I say sometimes, I mean, there was probably more speculation about extraterrestrial life 300 years ago than there is today.
You have so many great excerpts and entertaining pieces taken from books, newspaper articles from all over Europe. It must be pretty handy to be able to speak Spanish and read French and English as well. And I can just imagine you sifting through these dusty old archives and coming across treasures that no one else has ever found before, or for a couple hundred years.
That's why these days I've got to wear glasses, I think. The same thing happened to Charles Fort in his day. He used to spend hours and hours sitting in the libraries in London and New York, going through old newspapers and taking notes. Of course, these days I just take a photo on the mobile phone, or I make a note on the laptop. But yeah, it's something that you have to be quite dedicated to. I mean, these days you do have the possibility of searching millions, hundreds of millions of pages with a single click.
Right.
If you go to there are a lot of sites like newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com. And that really, really helps. It does save you a lot of time.
We're going to go to a break. Chris Aubeck, Alien Artifacts, Volume 1 is the book. We're talking with Chris Aubeck about an ambitious research project, Volume 1, Alien Artifacts, the forgotten story of how we came to believe in visitors from the stars. He's got great examples of newspaper stories that turned out to be hoaxes, tales about aliens, ETs, saucers, and not saucers, but vehicles from other planets Going to get into those, hear about how they made their way into newspapers and how people took them seriously right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Chris, you have some great examples of newsmen, journalists who are writing for newspapers, presumably actual news, who write these tall tales that turn out to be completely false, made up. I can recall, Mark Twain when he came to Nevada here and wrote some tall tales for a newspaper in Virginia City. It was kind of laughed at and everything, but some of these were, the examples that you used were taken seriously for a very long time.
It's true. Throughout the 19th century, there were so many newspapers in the United States that a way of selling them to the public. I mean, there were actually 4 or 5 local newspapers in some small towns. That one way to gain readership was to make up stories, and many of them had to do with meteorites that fell from space, meteorites covered in hieroglyphics sometimes, crashed spaceships, and even weird extraterrestrial creatures running around the desert. And these newspapers would try to get together a kind of posse to go and look for them, hunt them down, and bring them back. So, yeah, it was something that was also done to attract tourism. So there were tales of crashed spaceships just outside of town, and then they'd publicize this to see if they could get as many people to come to visit the town as possible. And
well,
often when they arrived, they'd say, if you want evidence of this spaceship that's just mysteriously disappeared, by the way, you're not going to find it now, come to our local bar, and you'll find there a piece of metal that belonged to that ship. So it was an interesting ploy to generate tourism. But as I always say, none of this means that that UFOs didn't exist at the time, because simultaneously there were some very good reports. I mean, simultaneously people did pay more attention to the sky because there was so much talk of extraterrestrial visitors that there were lots of good reports, good sightings being made. Because it became such a popular pastime to look out of the window and stare at the clouds.
You personally did the research in exposing some of these stories, these hoaxes that were reported long ago and survived into modern times, were repeated into, this in 19th century, 20th century, 21st century by UFO authors, right?
Yeah, that's right. For example, there's the story from a place called Carcarañá, which is in Argentina, about a spaceship that crashed around the year 1870, and it involved an extraterrestrial mummy that was found and taken to a local hotel and put on exhibition, and people went there to have a look at all of these hieroglyphics and strange metal plaques with drawings of planets and things on them. And this tale, which I found in Spanish, had actually been based on one published in French 6 years before that in Paris. And what happened at the time was a lot of stories were just being repeated constantly, and the names were changed and the places were changed. But then in the 20th century, a lot of modern ufologists have found these, they've rediscovered them, thought they were real, and put them into books. So the Carcarañá tale, for example, appears in several UFO catalogs of the 20th and 21st century. And if you look these things up online, you'll find people going out there with metal detectors, trying to find, the nuts and bolts from these fictional spaceships, which is a little bit sad, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, to let people know that not every crashed spaceship of the past was real. And what does that mean about modern ones? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think probably there is a town or two that have used crash spaceship stories to attract tourism. They don't mind that people belly up to the bar in their local watering hole. You have some great examples of some of the best authors of all time who use aliens and spaceships, things of that sort, as literary devices. I'm thinking about Washington Irving, for example. I didn't know he had written some of the stuff that you highlight in this book.
Yeah, because what he did was to write a book called A History of New York, published in 1809, and his story was about the Earth being under attack by a group of green-skinned moon men who saw humans as primitive animals. And they sent a mission to colonize the Earth with the goal of converting the wild and unfaithful people to their moon ways. So they managed to defeat the Earth's armies by riding winged horses with eagle heads and using armor that deflected bullets and cannon fire. Then they actually capture the world leaders, including Napoleon and the President of the United States, and take them back to the moon as prisoners. And they said that the colonization of Earth was considered a great success. And that was 1809. So there we're talking about an invasion of Earth. We're talking about abduction and even green-skinned extraterrestrials. So all of these ideas are so incredibly old.
You have some instances that are basically made-up stories that are incredibly similar to what we consider to be factual encounters, the types of beings, what we would call grays, short, skinny little creatures, as well as encounters with Nordics, which are people are still seeing those today. Give me your general take on the stories that were presumably made up back then and their similarities to what are supposedly factual now.
Yeah, it's a very interesting problem. It's almost a dilemma in a sense, because what do we do with the fact that from 1848, people actually wrote stories about beings who arrived on Earth in spaceships and were blonde, blue-eyed, and basically they look like Scandinavians. And it's what were later called Nordics by ufologists, which is a term which, of course, was actually invented by anthropologists in the 19th century who reached the conclusion that superior beings in the universe would naturally look like that. They would naturally have blue eyes and blonde hair and basically look like Captain America. So it's a bit of a problem to see that this figure of a Nordic alien, a Nordic entity, was invented by anthropologists. They weren't talking about aliens at the time, just the idea that superior beings would look like this. And then we find the same stories as today, all the way through the 19th century, in which every extraterrestrial sort of conforms to that general description, because people thought that any alien able to reach Earth had to look like that, because they would be much more advanced than normal humans. So we have two choices here. Either we reach the conclusion that aliens really can look like Nordic entities, or this is just a continuation of something that was invented in the middle of the 19th century. And not for very good reasons either, because, of course, this was a very racist concept. The same people who believed that superior entities were blue-eyed and blonde-haired believed that people of other colors, other nationalities, were incredibly inferior, which is why at the time a lot of people began to think that maybe Adam and Eve had come from other planets. I mean, even in the middle of the 19th century, this theory was quite popular. And that Adam and Eve would have been white-skinned, blue-eyed, and blonde-haired, which meant that the Chinese and the Africans and so on must have come from inferior planets. Of course, these are very racist ideas, but, these days we still have this idea of the Nordic entity. What does that mean? And in the book, I'm not saying that this is definitely something made up. I'm not saying that we shouldn't believe in these things these days. Maybe Nordic entities exist. I don't know. Maybe some of your listeners have met one. But we need to open up these questions.
Well, of course, we don't know what any of these things, if they're actually visitors, really look like. They seem to be able to take different forms and try to appeal to us one way or another. You write about things that get really messy, where we start mixing in stories about alien visitors, life on other planets, and spiritualism here. I think Victor Hugo, is that what he get involved with?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because Victor Hugo was a French author of Les Miserables, for example, and this was a period when spiritualism was a major movement throughout the world, and there was this practice of talking tables or table turning, which was really popular in Europe in the 1850s, and this involved people sitting around a table, placing their hands on it, and waiting for it to move, just like in the horror movies. And it was a kind of Ouija, like a Ouija board. Then Victor Hugo also participated in this practice of table turning. And once he had a conversation with a Jupiterian, someone from Jupiter, called Tiatiafia, who sort of had who spoke to him about life on Jupiter and asked questions about life on Earth, because at that time people practicing spiritualism didn't only try to communicate with the spirits of departed mortals, but also with spirits on other planets. And so it was an amazing time, because for several decades there was this idea that anybody could have a chat with a Martian or a Venusian just by sitting around a table and joining hands with friends. So it was a very, very interesting time to be alive.
It gets messy too if spiritualists, as many were, get discredited. It reflects badly on the notion that there is life on other planets. If they're not talking to spirits, then who the heck are they talking to on these other planets?
That's true. But at the same time, there was so much interest in the possibility that we were being visited by spaceships with delegations of Martians or Venusians or whatever, that it wouldn't have had such a terrible impact. And in any case, spiritualism of this kind carried on into the 20th century. So there's an overlap between this kind of practice and then the start of the flying saucer era in 1947.
One of the people who took a shot at writing a novel that involved people on other planets was an astronomer named Kepler, who's a pretty famous guy. He took his own stab at this. What do you make of his book?
Yeah, of course. I mean, a lot of these authors did actually try to rationalize life in the universe, thinking that maybe it was possible that there were other planets and things full of people. Then, when Johannes Kepler in 1634 published a book called Somnium, it was about an Icelandic traveler who was transported to the moon by aerial demons, and this was something which a lot of people speculated about at the time. Maybe demons were able to traverse the solar system and maybe even take the souls of the dying or the dead and whisk them off to some other part of the cosmos, to some dark planet full of evil beings. This was actually a very common thought at the time. I mean, we're talking about the 17th century there. I don't think today that's reflected in any part of ufology. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that the idea that demons living on other planets taking human souls, I haven't heard of that, at least in the 21st century.
You do get into very specific details about various religions and how they appropriated the story and made use of their own. We're going to do that in the next hour. I wanted to ask you in the time we have remaining in this segment about the first contactee that your book identifies. I think it's Swedenborg. Is that the name?
Yeah, that's right. Swedenborg was a very, very interesting contactee. Swedish. He was an intellectual. We're talking about the 16th, 17th century. He wrote a book called Earths in the Universe, and he spoke about how he was taken to all kinds of planets, even planets outside the solar system, where he saw life on other planets. And he even spoke about the Mercurians, people from Mercury, who had a very strong parallel with modern day aliens, because they wore these seamless, tight clothes made of unusual fabrics, and could even read minds and try to absorb people's thoughts, because the idea was that they were obsessed with getting information about the universe. So that's a very strong parallel with modern contactees.
Yeah, that was a really interesting chapter. You go into a lot of detail about, and so much of what he wrote back then, it seems preposterous that he traveled to other planets, but it sure resonates and is similar to a lot of accounts that we hear now. We're talking with Chris Aubeck about Alien Artifacts, Volume 1. How many volumes do you think you're going to have? It sounds like you've got a heck of a lot of material.
Well, in fact, there's going to be 3 volumes, and I imagine that I could actually write several more. But all of this, in fact, is part of a bigger plan that I have this year to finally publish all of the findings I've made over the last 20 years, many of which support the idea that something really weird has happened in the past and still happens today. But this series of books, Alien Artifacts, provides a context, the social and cultural context that we need to understand if we want to know whether what's happening today has any echo in the past. We need to know where a lot of the ideas that we have these days actually came from. And it's just something that had never been done before. And then one thing I haven't mentioned so far in any interviews is that this year I'm also going to release a refresh of Wonders in the Sky.
Oh, hold on. Chris, we're going to have to take a break. Hold on just a second. I want to get into that in the next segment here. I want to hear about that because that's just a wonderful book, and people need to know what's coming on that. We're talking with Chris Aubeck. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back with our final hour of Coast to Coast. Over the centuries, as we know, religions have both embraced and vehemently rejected the idea of people living on other planets. It's kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the faith. Chris Aubeck has documented the evolution of spiritual beliefs as they relate to ET beings, and I think it's one of the most interesting parts of his ambitious new book, Alien Artifacts, Volume 1. He dives into the ancient aliens thesis that's so widely known today because of TV shows, and we're going to dip into those and other subjects momentarily, and we'll open up the phone line sometime in the next 20 minutes or so we'll be right back. Welcome back. Of all the UFO books I have in my library, and I've got a heck of a lot of them, there's one called Wonders in the Sky that might be the most impressive and likely the most beautiful. I kind of got in on the ground floor of this book that Chris wrote with Dr. Jacques Vallée. He had to kind of invest, a crowdfunding kind of a thing, but this particular volume is just spectacular. I think there are other versions of the book that were published widely. But Chris, you were telling us before the break that you've got a new updated version coming out.
Yeah, so in the coming months, I want to release a refresh, as I call it, of Wonders in the Sky, which is this book which I wrote with Jacques Vallée 13 years ago. And a lot has changed in this time. We've made corrections. I found new material. Some cases had to go. So in the next few months, I want to publish a new history of UFO sightings from history. And as it's a new book, it'll have totally new content. and probably a new name. And I know a lot of people have been looking forward to getting an updated and revised version of this book, because it's become a classic in UFO literature because it's so unique.
Oh my gosh, it's terrific. You know, I recall there's a famous image in this book that's been reprinted elsewhere. I think it's a wood carving. It's from Nuremberg in the 1500s, something like that, of what looks like an aerial battle, a whole bunch of orb-like craft in the sky. What do you make of that now that you've had a lot of time to think about it and have done so much research in archives?
Yeah, right. That's the 1561 celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg, and it's a very interesting picture because you can see what looks like a town, the town of Nuremberg, right at the bottom of the picture. Then above that, there's the sun and all kinds of objects floating over it, spheres and crosses, arrows, and all kinds of things. There are a lot of interpretations of this. It was published as a broadsheet, which is basically the old version of a newspaper. And some people believe that it might be sundogs, some kind of reflective phenomenon involving the sun. But if you look closely, you can also see that some of these spheres are on the ground and emitting smoke, which does make you wonder whether it could be something a little bit more interesting than just an optical illusion. I've found a lot of other stories, very similar ones, that talk about spheres that descend to ground level, some of which also emitted smoke or steam. So one of my goals with this new book is going to be to show the connections between phenomena of this kind. It's very, very difficult to reach a firm conclusion about what might have happened as long ago as 1561, but at least you can make connections, and then with a bit of luck, people will find UFO cases that resemble this instance too. It's impossible to say what it was at this late stage.
Give me a sense of what's going on in some of the other civilizations and cultures around the world. You've done a great job in this book looking at archives in Europe and North America. There's some reference to China, but how far back do alien stories go in Chinese culture?
Yeah, it's very interesting because Chinese civilization used to document all kinds of astronomical and meteorological observations. So you find stories about strange lights in the sky descending onto lakes and simply in the countryside. You find encounters between farmers, just normal Chinese people from 500 or 600 years ago, and beings from the sky, which often arrived with bright lights and interesting celestial phenomena. There was a lot of it, and at the same time, from the 11th century onwards, there was a strong interest in China and Japan about the possibility that we live in a universe populated by extraterrestrials. So it all sort of coincides. Of course, what normally happens is that you have, on the one hand, the strange encounters that people could interpret as visits from ghosts or demons or gods, and on the other side, you have the philosophical speculation that we're living in a populated cosmos, and the two very rarely sort of met in the middle. On the other hand, there is a 10th century Japanese science fiction story, really, about a child who was found in a field of wheat, who later grew up and admitted that she was a member of a powerful family on the moon that one day would come and abduct her and take her home again. So there you do find cultural references to extraterrestrials visiting the Earth. But yeah, it's extremely interesting. I've always wanted to find more members from my group in China, Japan, and India to see if we can gather more information on what people consider to be evidence of alien life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about India next. There are some stories I recall. I can't remember what the term is about these aerial battles, these huge aerial battles. I don't know if it's considered folklore or if these are historical accounts, India, and how far back they go.
Well, yeah, I mean, in India, there were some great huge books like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which Sanskrit epics that are several thousand years old. Some of them date to the 3rd century AD, and some parts of them to 400 BC. And they talk about aerial cities, gods and demons who flew around in vehicles and chariots and things. And they seem to describe an interaction between deities, celestial deities, and humans. So this fits in very much into the ancient astronaut, ancient aliens narrative, which is why they've always been very popular in books by, for example, Erich von Däniken, and among people who believe that our ancestors were visited many years ago, thousands of years ago, by civilizations who came here to educate our ancestors in science and art and culture and so on. So yeah, apart from that, many years ago too, when I was about 16 years old, in fact, I was a member of an organization called the International Society for the Investigation of Ancient Civilizations in Madras, India. And I was amazed how casually they talk about alien contact thousands of years ago. I mean, modern Indian scholars interpreting ancient books like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata as if they were textbook descriptions of extraterrestrial visitors in ancient India. So there's a lot to talk about there, and I'd love to get in touch with people in India, maybe someone who's listening to this, so I can find out to what extent they also have records of UFO sightings, because that's an area that's very much missing from our records.
So as a teenager, you're a kind of wild child. You're spending your time in contact with archivists in India and elsewhere around the world, swapping stories and old articles about ancient aliens. You're out of control.
When I was about 15, 16 years old, I was a member of the Ancient Astronaut Society, which was set up by Erich von Däniken's lawyer, Gene Phillips, in Illinois. And that was a very exciting time in my life, receiving the bi-monthly bulletin, Ancient Skies. That's a way how I also contacted lots of authors in the field. And then when I was 18, I went off to America. I visited a lady in Minnesota who'd written a book, 1,030 pages, called The Greatest Story Never Told, which discussed ancient astronauts and all of these ancient books, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and so on, and tried to show that our ancestors were technologically extremely advanced. And she also writes in this book that we originally had green skin and pointed ears. I'm not sure how true that would be. And then I also spent a couple of weeks in California with Vaughn M. Green, who wrote the first books about the dogu, some Japanese statuettes, which have been interpreted as sort of figures wearing NASA-type spacesuits. And you can actually see photos of these in many ancient astronaut books of the 1970s and 1980s. And he actually wrote the first couple of books ever about these little statuettes. And they honestly do look very alien. They have sort of helmets and what look like visors and what very much look like suits. I mean, there are other interpretations. They could be tattoos. They could be a very primitive form of sunglasses. In any case, I spent several weeks in the States visiting authors on this subject, and I returned to England with the ambition of getting to the bottom of it all, at least historically, looking for the earliest cases.
Sounds like you were very much open to the idea, the theory that we had visitors and had help along the way. In this volume, you kind of you take a different tack on it. You're a little bit critical of at least some of the underpinnings, and you document that it's been around a long time. These ideas have been around a long time before Erich von Däniken.
Yeah, that's right. What most people didn't know was that 2023, this year, is actually the 200th anniversary of the alien ancestors theory, the ancient astronaut theory, because it was in 1823 that a French businessman named Francois Chabrier published a book in which he claimed that the primitive tribes of Earth, as he put it, had encountered extraterrestrials who'd been stranded here since their planet exploded. And these beings, he said, were far superior to humans and taught them culture and technology. And he said that Earthlings could consider them to be gods. And that's why our myths and legends are so full of stories about beings from the sky. And it is amazing that this was published so long ago in 1823. It's something that, I mean, this information has never been out there before, but I've spent the last 10 years or so piecing together the origins of the ancient astronaut theory. This book, Alien Artifacts, is the first one to show how that originated. The problem is, of course, that Francois Chabrier and his theory were completely legitimate at the time, and it was a very interesting way of explaining why there are asteroids which had recently been discovered. He thought that they had belonged to a planet that had exploded, and it was a way of explaining away mythology on Earth, Greek mythology, and so on, and UAPs, out-of-place artifacts. But after that, over the next 60 years, this is even before Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy, which had previously been believed to have started this whole trend of ancient astronauts. Over the next 60 years, from 1823 onwards, so many books came out trying to show that our ancestors had come from outer space, that this turned into an excuse for colonizing certain countries and continents, like Australia, for example. In 1870, Auguste Dufresne, a French geographer, presented the idea that the whole continent of Australia had fallen from the sky into the Pacific Ocean. So Australia was an asteroid, and this way he didn't only try to explain the existence of koalas and kangaroos and aborigines, which he thought weren't even human, but he said that this meant that that white men, Europeans in particular, had every right to take Australia for themselves, because it was as if Australia were a tennis ball that had fallen into our yard, and nobody had come to reclaim it.
There's a story, I'm not sure, we've got about a minute left, so we'll probably have to wait to the other side, but there's a my favorite novelist is a guy named Tom Robbins, and one of the hilarious books that he wrote plays on the story of the Dogon, these Africans who have a connection to Sirius and seemingly learned somehow long, long ago about the star structure, astronomical details they couldn't possibly have known, didn't have telescopes, but they have a connection to Sirius, legends about Sirius. I'm sure you're familiar with that. If you want to take a stab at it, we're going to go to a break in about 40 seconds, but we can at least start on it.
Yeah, well, the Sirius Mystery was a book written by Robert K.G. Temple, who was a very good historian. And it suggests that the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa had been in contact with aliens, and a lot of the information that had been given to them by the aliens have been preserved in their mythology. And it sort of shows sort of similarities between Dogon and Egyptian and Sumerian beliefs and so on.
Oh, so they might have borrowed it from somewhere. We're talking with Chris Aubeck. Sorry to interrupt you. We're going to a break. I promise we'll pick that up on the other side, and then we'll get right to the phones. Some folks hanging on with questions for my guest. Chris Aubeck, before the break, I sort of crammed in a reference to a novel, Dogon. We were talking about Dogon and their knowledge of Sirius. And if you're looking for, in future volumes, a literary example of how the story evolved, the Dogon and their knowledge of Sirius, the book I referenced is a novel. It's called Half Asleep in Frog Pajamas by Tom Robbins, who his work was influenced by Terence McKenna. It's a very funny book, very strange and insightful. So if you're looking for something to read, that's a good one. But you think that the Dogon may have learned about Sirius from the Egyptians?
Well, there are a lot of different theories about how they got their information. I mean, what Robert Temple says is that they have information about Sirius that they could never have known, that Sirius had a companion star, Sirius B, which is invisible to the naked eye. But a lot of scholars and scientists have argued that the Dogon's knowledge of Sirius can be explained away by European explorers who shared a lot of astronomical information with them. People also say that it's possible that well, actually, they've sent anthropologists to visit the Dogon in the last 20 years, and they haven't found a trace of what Robert Temple said he had found. So I'm beginning to wonder whether any of it is actually true. But it's a very interesting theory that they were visited by aliens in the ancient past. It's simply not possible to demonstrate, and maybe there's no trace of that information nowadays among Dogons of this generation.
Oh, that's too bad. I hope if somebody out there has information on it that they'll reach out to us. We're going to go to the phones on the wild card line. Myad in New York. Hey, young lady. Good morning.
Yes. Good morning, gentlemen. George, such an excellent show and program. First of all, my understanding around the Dogon is that they identified Sirius B before any Europeans had identified or had the means to identify it. So to me, that's clear. But I want to say to you, Chris, first of all, I generally appreciate your work. And I want to make some comment, and then I'll ask two parts, a question, and listen over the air. I appreciate the fact that this idea of the Nordics in terms of anthropologists and how that came about, because we need to deal with it because it's getting much worse, but the idea of white people is a social concept not related to the existence of any race. So we need to get a hold of that. So I appreciated your comments. But my questions are, first of all, somebody that we heard of named George Norrie did a blurb, a great blurb, very pithy on the back of the book. He said, the go-to book on life in the universe. And I want to know if you're familiar with, and George, this question is also to you because I'd like to have Craig Campobasso on as a guest. I might have missed him previously, but the book is called The Extraterrestrial Species Almanac. And he uses the correct word, species, but when I write to him inside the book, he refers to race, which is incorrect. But he gives illustrations and a wonderful breakdown in terms of belief system, craft, technology, consciousness, the mentality. It's a really excellent book. So I want to know if you're first familiar with the book. And if you are, and George, this is to you too, which I imagine, what are the illustrations, do they line up with how you assess them? And George, if you could maybe get in touch with Craig and let us know if you've had him on the air, if you could bring him on the air, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about your background, how you got involved in this area, which is just totally fascinating. I mean, humanity is so unconscious in so many ways, but they need, as we go into the Aquarian age, get evolve more quickly than seems to be happening right now. But Chris, if you have my questions and concerns, I'll listen over the air. Thank you so much, George.
Okay. I'll just answer it for me. I don't think I have that. I have a couple of books that sound similar. They list and illustrate a number of different presumed alien species, but I don't think that I have that one by Craig, and I don't think I've interviewed him. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you. Chris?
Well, yeah, I know about this book, The Extraterrestrial Species Almanac, and it's interesting. It's actually got a list of 82 extraterrestrial species, mainly based on I think it's based on remote viewing, on encounters, this kind of thing. This is where they get the information from. Well, the only thing I can say is that this idea that there's a multitude of races visiting the Earth is actually quite an old one. I have a chapter in the book about a man called William Denton who used a kind of remote viewing with his family in the 1860s and 1870s to visit other planets, and there each member of the family, sort of under hypnosis in a trance, visits different parts of a planet and then tells him what they see there, and they do seem to come up with completely different-looking extraterrestrial beings. So, yeah, it is a very old idea that lots of different species visit the Earth. On the other hand, of course, there's the possibility, and it's a strong one, that if everybody uses a little bit of imagination and comes up with their own variety of extraterrestrial visitor, that's the logical thing that's going to happen. People will end up with 82 or 182 varieties of alien visitor of all kinds of descriptions. So I don't really trust an almanac of 82 different species of aliens, I'm afraid, but it's a very interesting book.
Thanks for the call. On the West Coast line, Tim in Texas, or west of the Rockies, I should say. Tim in Texas. Hey, Tim, how you doing? What's on your mind?
I'm doing well. How are you guys doing? Thanks for having me on.
Sure.
I just want to ask this quick question. First of all, have you had any personal experiences yourself? And if so, would you mind sharing them? And also, does your book cover, or do you have information about, say, like Russian or island cultures that, like, had some extraterrestrial experiences? I'll listen to what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that on the 6th of April, 1996, I witnessed a UFO myself in a small group of friends. There were about 6 or 7 of us in a park late in the evening in a town called Talarrubias in Spain, and it was rectangular, luminous, orange. It was in the sky for about 10 minutes. It wasn't moving in any direction. Then, as we were talking about it, it disappeared, and then it reappeared a few minutes later in a different part of the sky. I've thought about this for many years. I haven't come to any firm conclusion about it. I don't say that it was extraterrestrial, but then again, I can't say it wasn't. I have absolutely no idea what we were looking at. But yeah, we saw something.
He asked about other parts of the world, the island nations, Oceania, Russia as well.
Well, in the book, I mention the figure of the tiki in New Zealand, which is very curious. They actually well, I don't know if you know about the little tikis. They actually make them of plastic these days, but they used to be made of other minerals, and they are green. And they said that they came from the moon, and they visited humans at some point in antiquity. And these days, you can actually buy little plastic amulets to represent these little tiki beings, which is very nice. I have a friend called Peter Hassel in New Zealand who's going to send me one of these that I can show to people during conferences. This book does mention Russia, but the next one is even more interesting, the next volume, because I have a case there about, this is from 1884, of like giant meteorites crashing down into a Russian city. And when someone opens one up, they find an extraterrestrial mummy inside. And there's also another Russian story about an object like a meteorite that comes from the sky. And when they open that up, they find a frog inside, a sort of a dried frog, which they take out very carefully and they put it in a bucket of water and it comes back to life. And there are lots of other stories like that. They're all from the 1880s, and it was a time when there were so many tales of extraterrestrial visitors, and this is the reason why the series is called Alien Artifacts, because I'm going to get deeper and deeper into this subject.
Excellent.
It's going to lots and lots of strange objects from the sky.
Excellent. Well, I really like Volume 1. I can't wait for Volume 2. We'll go to the international line. Carl in Canada. Hi, Carl.
Hello. God bless. I remember when I was a kid, I read a comic book that said Jesus came to all the planets. I wasn't into the superhero comics like the classic science fiction, thriller, horror. And, I did have a couple UFO experiences. Coming back from fishing late at night, the bright light, it was a bright light flashing above the highway. I just kept looking down. I just kept driving and fishing by myself, came back late. It was dark. And then I shared already about on coast to coast. I lived about 3-4 houses down from, the newspaper said it was Canada's biggest water tower. They tore it down already. And we seen like lights in formation. Somebody was up there like 3 times. He had some problems, and but it all worked out okay. And I do believe like there was a war in heaven. The UFOs are angelic. 1/3 of the angels got kicked out of heaven, and so I don't think they're angelic. So I don't think they're. My question is actually, do you think UFOs are like nuts and bolts? It's metallic, like it's something else.
Carl, let's let me rephrase your question a little bit. We didn't get a chance to delve too deeply into the religious part of it, but that's a really interesting part of your book, Chris. How different faiths at different times have both embraced it and rejected the idea of both Jesus being an alien or other aliens visiting us or life on other planets. I mean, the Catholics didn't like it for a long time. The Mormons, as you write, it's pretty basic aspect of their faith.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, the first thing that the gentleman is called mentions the idea of Jesus Christ and whether he could have been a visitor from somewhere. I mean, chapter 7 of my book is called The Intergalactic Messiah, and I get into the subject of whether Jesus Christ was ever considered a space traveler, whether he visited other planets and so on. And it's very, very interesting. I mean, it's a short chapter, only about 5 pages, as many of the chapters are, because these days it's always a good idea to keep chapters quite short, I find. But it does talk about 500 years of people considering that Jesus was a space traveler. Then in chapter 6, the previous one, that's called The Planet of God, and it goes into the topic of the Mormons, Jehovah's Witness too, and the Seventh-day Adventists. They all have some kind of connection with the idea that we live in an inhabited universe. Then the other idea of angelic UFOs. I want to mention just one more time. W. Raymond Drake was one of the pioneers of the ancient astronaut theory. He told me too on the phone and in a letter that he believed that UFOs were actually God's angels coming to visit the Earth, but he never said that in any of his books, because he told me that no one would ever believe him. So, all of these are very interesting ideas. The idea of a nuts and bolts UFO, I would love that to be true. Some people would pick this book up and say, well, it seems a little bit skeptical, looking at the prehistory of ufology and showing there were hoaxes here and hoaxes there. Well, the thing is, you really need to know about this kind of thing if you want to measure the reality of what's going on today. We need to know what came before, and I would love there to be nuts and bolts spaceships visiting Earth. I think it'd be fantastic, and it'd be a wonderful moment for humanity. So my mind is entirely open about that. I'm just waiting for the day we find some kind of proof.
Yeah, I mean, given all the progress that's been made in terms of public interest, congressional interest, scientists who never would given this the time of day are now diving into it. It's important to be accurate and to separate wheat from chaff for these kind of cases.
Well, exactly. And apart from that, I'd say that UFOs and aliens are a part of human cultural history. It's in our literature, our philosophy. It's in our art. It's practically a branch of humanities that people would like to sweep under the rug. It's where we are in the universe, our place in the cosmos, and our potential relationship to other life, on other planets. It has been studied at high academic levels. This is the whole history of belief in aliens and so on. But the books that I'm publishing now, Alien Artifacts, it's the first time that anyone's made a history of the idea that aliens are actually visiting us instead of being an intangible life source somewhere else in the galaxy. Someone had to do it, and that's what I've done.
Chris Aubeck, thanks so much for being here. It was terrific talking with you. This book is just jam-packed with great stuff. Alien Artifacts from Antiquity to 1880, Volume 1. Can't wait for Volume 2. Hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Yeah, I will. And once I've published the refresh of Wonders in the Sky, I'd love to talk to you about it.
Absolutely. Let me know. Thanks, Chris. Thanks also to Mike Cifone, our earlier guest, and to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Michael Cosio and Donna Walker, Lex Lone Hood, Dan Kalane, Chris Boros, Lisa Lyon, Tom Danheiser, and George Norrie, of course, and his team. Good night, everyone. I'll be back next Sunday night.